So Roy, in chapter 2 of my book, I asked a question at the beginning of the chapter. Who is Isha? Who is woman? And where did she come from? In Genesis 1:27, it says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And then in Genesis chapter 5, it says, and he created them, male and female created he them, and he blessed them, and he called their name Adam. So, did he create two people? Did he create one person? Who is this, and where does woman come from?
Well, of course, Adam just means humankind.
Right.
So we have to consider, and this is difficult for a lot of people. I understand that. But we have to consider that this is an allegory. And we have to look at it as an allegory. Here we're talking about the creation of Adam from the afar of the Adamah, created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God and the likeness of God, to be like God. He breathes into his nostrils that portion of himself. And the purpose of man is to be a reflection of deity. But then we have the specifics of God creating Eve. And there's a purpose for that, and a very important purpose. And it's not, as some might think from reading the book, from reading the Bible, that God created a woman just to be a help for man. Help do this and help do that, and so on and so forth. Whenever you look at it in the Hebrew text, it's much more dramatic. And so let's take a look at the Hebrew text here in Genesis chapter 2, when in verse 18, God says, Eselo Ezer Kenegdo. I will make him a helper corresponding to him. And because most people don't know Hebrew, they get hung up just on the term helper, that woman is to be a help for man and help do this and help do that. But that's not what the purpose is, and we'll look at that more in detail. But let me show you something here. Here, this is Bereshit again, Genesis, and on page 107, down here at the bottom of the page, it says, according to Rambam, that's Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides, the verse is to be explained, but for the name Adam, he found no helpmate suited to correspond to himself. It was thus God's will that man not be given a wife until he came to the realization that he had had no suitable mate above the living creatures. You remember that God created all the living creatures and brought them before Adam, and whatever Adam named them, that was their name. But among those living creatures that God had created, he found none that was an Ezer Kenegdo. And here he says, and he would therefore crave for fitting companionship as befitting as she. And then Hirsch, another commentary, expresses, but for Adam, a vice-regent of God on earth, which is what Adam was created to be, he found none that would be parallel to himself, none that could share his obligation with him. Man indeed found animals which would be helpful and serviceable to him. They could qualify as their help. But what he could not find among all the creatures that passed before him was kenegdo, one that would correspond to him on an equal social and intellectual level. And that leads us to say that before we go on, we need to take a very careful look at this passage when it says, and God created for Adam and Ezer kenegdo. Let me take you to the board over here for just a moment. And I have written these words up on the board. Ezer just means a help. I've created a help. But the main word that we want to look at and note what it means is kenegdo. Kenegdo. You try to look that up in a Hebrew dictionary, you're going to have trouble finding it. Because, as you know, all of the words in Hebrew lexicon, and here is Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon, Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon on page number 617. And if you have a Strong's Concordance or any kind of concordance that's numerically indexed, this is number 5048. 5048, and it's not easy to find. I'll admit that. Not easy to find because it's under the root neged. You look at it, you won't find it under Ezer kenegdo. You find it only under neged, which is the root, neged. And here we have 5048 on page 617. And here you have the exact passage here that's given to you as definition number 2. It says, with the preposition kenegdo, according to what is in front of or corresponding to Genesis 2:18, I will make him Ezer kenegdo, a help corresponding to him, but here's the deal, i.e. equal to and adequate to or for himself. Among all of the animals of the field, there was no Ezer kenegdo. And Ezer kenegdo, when it says that God is going to make for him an Ezer kenegdo, it means one who is adequate for and equal to in every way. It's not as woman is some kind of subservient creature who is not on an equal basis with God as Adam, but it means one who is equal to him in every way. Now, let's go on and look at something else, and that is, so it says that God causes a deep sleep to come upon man. And he took a chat metzalotav. He took one of his ribs, and from that he formed Adam. That's an interesting passage. An interesting passage. In that word, Selah, is never, ever again translated anywhere in the biblical text as rib, but always as side. It's also translated, this is interesting I think, as a cell or a cage in which something was incarcerated or something was contained, but this was written thousands of years before we knew that every single cell in the human body contains all of the necessary ingredients to make an exact duplication in kind. And maybe that's all that it took, was a single cell with God.
And of course we know that today you can create another whole entity just from
An
one
exact
cell.
duplication, and we have done it in the laboratory.
Right, and it's called?
Dolly the sheep, you remember?
Yeah, and the process is called cloning, right?
Cloning.
And they knew nothing about that when this was
They
written.
knew nothing about it. Nothing whatsoever. But again, you see how this is not a scientific book. Wasn't meant to be scientific. Wasn't meant to be scientific. But when you look at it and you examine it, and you examine it carefully, on the basis of all of the knowledge and information that we have today at our disposal, it is indeed a scientific book. And there are no contradictions between this book and the best that we know in all of the scientific disciplines, once you know what this book says and once you know what science says.
Of course, we can't prove that it was a cell,
We can't.
but it certainly makes much more sense.
We can't.
You know, I can remember as a young boy counting my ribs to see if I had one less than the girls because God had taken one of them. But it makes a lot more sense that so there's this, and I put it in quotation marks, scientific explanation for what happened. So God takes Adam, which is this composite being, and out of Adam he makes another being that is the same as him, equal to him, adequate for him, basically the other side of the coin. And he brings this person to Adam. But how is she different from him? I've heard you say many times that scientifically and physiologically our bodies are almost identical. So how is it that we have now suddenly Ish and Isha, where before we just had Adam?
You have the female,
Yeah, female and male.
and you have the male. And that, although very few people realize it or understand it, that is what God is. He is both male and female. And if you look at the name of God, Yud, He, Vav, He. Now I'll put it on the board for you. The Yud, He, Vav, He, or YHWH. In Hebrew, the YH is male and the Vav, He is female.
So God being both male and female, or neither male nor female,
Neither male, but both.
but both, he creates someone who's just like that, but both, and then essentially separates the two.
Yes, and it's only when the two are joined back together again in matrimony, that they can become the reflection of the totality of all that God is.
And I'm going to spring this on you, but I want you just to say a little bit about what is written in the Hebrew text about that process, where it says, Vadabach ishtov. Vadabach ishtov. What does that convey to us in the Hebrew text if we translate that? Because that's really interesting to me. The word dabach or dabak.
Actually, the root of that word is devik.
Devik.
Devik, and in Hebrew, devik is glue. So, it's talking about that in matrimony, the male aspect and the female aspect are glued back together again.
Now that's interesting. You said glued back together again,
Yes.
which implies that once they were together, they've been separated, and now God puts them back. So actually, in matrimony, God takes what once was one, that perfect reflection of who He is. Having been separated, neither one of them is any longer the perfect reflection, because they're either male or female. But in matrimony, being put back together again and essentially glued back, they once again become that reflection of who God is.
Exactement.
Well, thank you, Dr. Blizzard. That was really interesting. We appreciate your input on that.